Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Hodges, and I'm the moderator for this afternoon's Building Leaders Through Wargaming session. I'd like to introduce you to today's participants, Mr. Colin Davis, Luke Hughes, Alec Lloyd, and Red Powell will be discussing this topic this afternoon. My primary job on the camera is now complete, so I'm going to turn my camera off, go on mute, and turn the floor over to Colin. Colin, thank you all very much.
Well, thank you so much. I believe we're working on getting the first slide deck up. And as we're doing that, I really want to thank you for having me, because as I've really experienced all the previous days and seen all the expertise, I kind of get a big sense of how much I still have to learn and develop. So I believe that is Luke's, if we can.
Yes, that's a little early on that one.
No, thank you. Yeah, so if we can go to the introduction slide real quick, I'd appreciate it.
I'm really not that aggressive a presenter. I don't try to take over the other decks, but I guess this time. We're having all our video images directly over the slide, so you can't see the content of the slide.
Yeah, so just quick introduction, building leaders through wargaming, right? That's what we're here to talk about today. And so, thank you, Jeff, for introducing us. Our bios are on the connection site, and so we won't take up too much time going through that, but we're really excited to be here today to discuss this topic, and we really appreciate the opportunity. And so, if you can go to the introduction slide. There's our agenda. We're going to go through a real quick introduction, and then we're going to allow everybody to speak for approximately 5 minutes on this topic, and then we'll go into a Q&A with a quick conclusion. So next slide, please. Thank you. So take that in real quick. I know it's a lot of text, but it's a great book for anybody that's interested. Just really serving to understand just how war games can be used and implemented, and all their different approaches, but really in our case specifically, and how war games are a form of training and education that can be used in a professional forum or environment in order to train leaders. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so real quick, so in my bio, I was fortunate at CGSC at Fort Leavenworth, where I was promoted to major to get a degree that was in war game design. And so with that, my topic then was, because I've been doing this with the Army for 16 years now, and I value, just from everything I've seen over that decade and a half in regards to leaders and leadership, two absolute things that you really need to understand what you're going into, and the leaders that you want and how you want to cultivate leaders in a culture of leadership. And so, what goes into creating leaders and what you need them to do. And there's so much that can, whether it's leaders or functions or tasks, wargaming can be brought into as a methodology that can help cultivate those leaders. And so I was fortunate, the war game I designed as the approach in getting my master's in wargame design was actually, how does the question that I demonstrated through the war game was, how does leader management, how you're managing leaders, how does that contribute or affect tactical execution? And so there was it was a wonderful exercise for myself, and being able to study there's an extremely broad range of leader sociology and psychology and everything that goes into it. And so when you start looking at that, and how do you train behaviors? How do you take personalities from where they start and get them there? Well, wargaming as a methodology and an approach, it allows you to, that funny quote that all models are wrong, some are just more useful than others, by George E.P. Box, perfect when it comes to wargaming, because just like wargaming in a training environment, there's always elements. You can't create a perfect. You're not going into real war. You're not going into a real scenario, and I think that's something that will be reflected throughout. And as it goes into this methodology, being able to create a model that answers the mail on what you need for the culture of leadership and the leaders that you're trying to go for. And so that's where, when it comes to war game design, what are you trying to teach? And the tactical execution model that I developed, it was a platoon level, down to the platoon level, as if you were a battalion commander and you were managing companies and battalions at the platoons. And so there's something very specific. And when you're looking at what war games you have are available and what you're trying to teach. And so these are the objectives, and these are what I want my leaders to learn. And here's the approach I'm implementing using wargaming to teach this, this, and this. And these are my objectives. And so I think those are very important questions to ask yourself when you're going through this process. With that, there's some great material to follow, and I really appreciate everybody's time. And I'll be followed by Colin Davis, who's going to take the lead. He's got some great material for you. So, Colin, you're up.
Well, thank you. So one of the main young leader issues I've sought to kind of work on over the years is really seems like lack of developmental repetitions and force-on-force opportunities, especially in the National Guard side. Ideally, I feel like we could kind of use some more opportunities and repetitions in like a fail-safe environment where young leaders can fail and learn and develop the competence in their craft, without kind of the upside eyes of other commanders and other subordinates as well. And also just to have repetitions to get a lot of familiarity in the multitudes of different tasks, missions, operations we can be called on to conduct. And doing those against a thinking opponent always adds that additional value. I am a fan of the Army type of training models between field training exercises, live fire exercises, situational training exercises, XCTCs, CTCs, combat center training, or combat training center rotations, deployments. It definitely seems like a good model. I just kind of feel like we could provide additional tools to help teach and develop those junior tactical leaders. So, as is kind of a background experience, my first platoon there at Fort Knox, the commander really used tactical exercises without troops, TOOTS, to kind of guide us and train us. At first, we would do them on maps, and then we went out and exercised those on training areas with Class 5 ammunition that brought in artillery, indirect fires, and then Army attack aviation as well. It was a great experience, but I noticed that all the other peer companies and platoons didn't do that as well all the time. That wasn't the general baseline standard, but it was a great experience. Now, if we can go to the next slide, later on after transitioning to the Indiana Army National Guard, as a commander there, I started instituting my own type of training for the platoon leaders and XOs. I tried to emphasize the integration of air assets and indirect fires, with emphasis on the risk estimate, distances, reds, doing all the deconfliction and synchronization for those operations as a learning experience. I also used many tactical decision games from sites like thecompanyleader.themilitaryleader.com as informal LPDs to help provide additional opportunities for them as well. And then more recently, next slide, please. I joined the Army Reserve National Guard Operations Group Wolf as an observer controller trainer. And that's where I really started to develop what I thought was a new training methodology because I hadn't really seen it before. Found a couple peers to trial test it with me and started conducting force-on-force map exercises. Wargaming, as I currently understood it with the military decision-making process, MDMP, didn't quite seem to fit as a junior leader developmental tool, seemed more for staffs. So I would call these tabletop exercises TTXs. We would do our mission analysis and create a course of action. would have to do the battle tracking, make tactical decision making, and use die probabilities and or random number generators and our experiential judgments to try and adjudicate all forms of contact and battle damage assessments for those kind of attacks to make it as no bullcat crap type of realistic as possible. So we first started where we could both see the main common operating picture, but then developed that into double blind exercises with a third person, an OC white cell. Next slide, please. And as we came into the COVID teleworking environment, we kind of shifted to a 3 or 4 slide common operating picture to conduct these exercises that would work on Microsoft Teams. This assisted with being able to have like our white cell master common operating picture, a blue 4 and then a red 4, where they could only see their movements and units, and then what we provided them for forms of contact and adjudication. We did also have the opportunity to kind of host a leader training session with that to share the methodology across all the NCOICs and OICs within the battalion. It was kind of an open forum, just training opportunity, not really a hardcore force on force double blind exercise. And it kind of got mixed reception because I don't know between the technology or something, it still seems like it's a new concept for people to be able to practice operations either via map or map on a screen. That's currently what I've experienced and developed so far. I appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Colin. We'll now be followed by Luke. Luke, go ahead.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure. I'm eminently less qualified than most of the panel members in terms of direct experience. I'm sorry to say I don't have military experience. On the other hand, where I think I hope I can bring some strength is I was a R&D director for a large multinational called Accenture. I founded a research lab in Palo Alto for them. And I'm doing a project called Burden of Command, which is specifically focused on the human qualities of leadership as well as the tactical aspects in a digital technological context rather than a field context. In other words, as a game. Now, from that context, and we'll start the video in just one moment. Thank you. When I think of war games, I think of it in the classic commercial sense of cardboard, right? Or digital, like a combat mission, etc. I'm not as much thinking, like many of these panelists and audience, of field operations and others, where I think there's fundamentally, inevitably, role-playing of roles and leaders because you're sitting around the map or you're out in the field and you encounter the human qualities because you can't avoid it. But in a classic cardboard or digital, often you don't. So our focus in Burden of Command is to try to inject that human, psychological, moral, and tactical quality into it. And I think we'll, at best at this point, we play a little 2-minute video. The sound will not play. There's some pleasant music for your future, so I can talk over it slightly, but this should introduce it. You're a company leader in World War II. He actually did do that. Pretty insane. Also not a historical one. Those are actually game attributes. So burden of command is, I think, distinctive in the commercial digital realm of war games, in that, as you can see, it's very heavily focused on the human aspects. You role play captain, you deal with your lieutenants and your NCOs and your enlisted, and we try heavily to draw from history. So, as we all know, I think history is, stranger than fiction. Truth is stranger than fiction. So I encourage our writers, we have professional writers, to go to history. One of our problems is we'll put things on from history in the game, and people say, oh, please, another Hollywood moment. So early on, probably to our commercial disadvantage, we decided to put footnotes in the game, probably the first game ever with footnotes. So when you see in a situation that seems particularly absurd, there's a little book icon, you can mouse over it, and we say, hey, that really seems absurd, the colonel standing out to be shot by the sniper so they could spot the sniper. Guess what? He did that. So I will say about 30 more seconds, which is technologically, our advantage in some sense is words and interactivity. Meaning, if we wanted to, I hope we don't, we could have a space alien land and ask you, if they should adopt tactics, because words can do anything. So we can, unlike most digital war games or cardboard, we can put you in any situation to perhaps inspire you in terms of what that might mean. If we were doing a modern Afghanistan one, we would obviously put you in the village, talking to the elders, trying to handle the civilian and subtle, soft issues that may get people killed or not. So we do that heavily. World War II had many of the same issues, maybe not quite as heavily, but a lot. So I won't continue on. I will say that we're advised by John McManus, Dr. John McManus, who is the military historian of the Cotton Balers, which were the 7th Regiment, as you all probably know, U.S. 3rd Division, and we follow them quite heavily. It is not a game in the technical sense, but I prefer to think of it as an engaging experience. If those of you might recognize the civilian game, This War of Mine, you play civilians in a war zone, so Sarajevo-like. I don't think anybody considers that game fun, but it's been extremely popular. And I hope Burden Command will not be fun, but extremely engaging.
Thanks, Luke. That was awesome. We really appreciate it. Handing it over to you, Out.
Thanks. So it's kind of interesting. I'm in a squadron that has a very strong wargaming culture. We stood up in 2009, and I'm a charter member, and I'm a wargamer. So that gave me a unique ability to kind of and we're a planning organization. We're a planning staff. So that gave me an opportunity to work the wargaming into it from the very beginning. And there was, for a long time, we had some building moves and everything where it was accepted that you play war games over lunch. And we had a number of simulations, and they got quite competitive. We follow the agile wargaming concept of using familiar things. So they use cards, playing cards, and maps and tokens, and everybody has a blast. People have been known to bring them to the bar, and they get really rowdy there. So the two topics, the kind of the bullets that I picked on are above and beyond. And what that does, wargaming, we've found over the years, is it does let you scope out to a higher level of responsibility. For most service members, the company command, the battalion command, group command, squadron command, those are like the center of light and knowledge, and everything that is good and right flows from them. That they know what's going on up there. We don't know what's going on, but sure they do. But the ability to go up to brigade, division, to theater where a wing is just a chess piece on a board for my fellow airmen, that is really helpful for leaders to not only understand how what they're doing impacts the big picture, but it also prepares them to start thinking at that leadership scale. So when a platoon leader is thinking about moving a company or moving a battalion and how that impacts it, that gives him better insight on that job. The other thing, and I think, let me see, I wrote it down. Yeah, Colin talked about this. This has been brought up a bunch. One of the burdens of going last is everybody's brought up all the good stuff, but mistakes. So I have a little different take. Yes, war games allow you to make mistakes and you can recover from them because it's a low threat environment. But actually, it allows you to make really good mistakes because they're constructive mistakes. If you get your plan crushed, if you make a move that absolutely backfires, people are going to go and they're going to analyze, why'd you move it? What might have happened if the other side had done something differently? And so there's an element of learning that happens through making mistakes in wargaming that you don't really get when you make mistakes anywhere else. And we've found that when we do some of these games, oftentimes someone who completely gets blown out gets more notoriety and positive attention because maybe they took a risk, maybe they did something that was thinking outside the box. It didn't pay off, but everyone's like, wow, that was bold. We respect that. And let's look at how maybe we can translate that boldness into a less catastrophic fail.
Very interesting.
That's awesome, Alec. So, I mean, tying a lot of this together, and Colin, you talked about using your TTXs. Luke, if you took the tabletop exercises and brought in the narrative aspects and the historical vignettes, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so there's a lot to be taken away from that, right? And so it's awesome to see how all this can play out and how we can all improve some of these methodologies. You talk about higher level planning. I mean, I just came from SAMS, the School of Advanced Military Studies, where we were planning at the core level, and we were talking about, and the narrative was a huge deal. And so you're absolutely right in regards, Alec, of planning at higher levels and going above and beyond, and how that prepared a lot of us that were going forward to be division planners, and the narrative aspect to that. And then, of course, how much historical studies we did, but also being able to appreciate, Colin, like the operational science and the tactical science that you learn at those lower levels. And so you're looking at this building, pyramid of wargaming and how it has contributed to this educational and training volume for leaders. And so a lot of that tying all together, I really appreciate all the different material and perspectives that we're bringing in today. Was there anything else? We'll move into Q&A unless there's anything else that someone wants to jump on real quick, because that was some great material from everybody. Thank you.
I'd just like to follow up on Alex's interesting comments at the end. He claimed that all the interesting stuff had been removed early, but I think it was quite interesting. He brought up, learning from failure, admiring risk-taking. One of the things we've learned in doing this is our target audience is to go outside the grognards, as we call them, to reach people who play tactical games and so forth, but are not war gamers, don't know anything about history. And what we've discovered is we have to do a lot of teaching. So I'll give one example that it's quite interesting. First, to give you a sense of it, we had some narrative pop up and we said, you'll need to go to HQ. And one of the playtesters, who's a smart person, said, what's an HQ? And I suddenly realized, boy, this is going to be a different experience, right? I'm a little too immersed as a hobby gamist. Second thing is we had a lot of complaints from people. We gave them the first scenario. It's you pretty much are a foot infantry company, but occasionally get armor support. We gave them tanks for the first time. So from all their other game experience, right, what do? Tanks are, of course, all powerful. And if they get in trouble, you can just put a healing tank, whatever the hell that is, behind it and fix it, right? Because this is what some other games teach. So they ran the tanks down the road. Well, the Germans aren't idiots, and the Germans put, tank mines in a way you really couldn't tell unless you had a lot of time, and they didn't often, in the road. And so their tanks got blown up. And so we had a conversation with the playtesters about how unfair this was, right? Well, the Germans didn't want it to be fair. But what was interesting is, what we learned is, if we could, in the spirit of what Alec was saying, intervene in the game after that and do a teaching moment, right? You just got your tank blown up. Sergeant Grant is kind of the voice of wisdom, right? The sergeant pops up and talks, and he sort of says something along the lines of, man, this sucks, sir. I know. The problem is we just don't have time to stop. So we don't have a choice here. What are we going to do? We got to keep pressing, but these mines are almost undetectable unless we wait for the engineers, and we can't. So, and then what we noticed is they started to learn, right? In subsequent scenarios, they started to learn, these tanks aren't immortal and invulnerable, and they keep them back as essentially a form of artillery support to the infantry advance and try to push the poor bastard infantry forward first. So teaching in the game will be quite important given the nature of our audience.
Luke, I think that's a great point in regards of going back to what I started off saying about what are what are the objectives and what are you trying to teach? And sometimes for the designer or the person running the game, you're left sometimes with determining, okay, well, I thought I was going to be teaching this, but I'm going to end up having to teach this part first, right?
Often.
So there's some good aspects to that. And I'm sure, Colin, you've probably seen something like that, especially as you've been working through with the tabletop exercises you said. Do you have anything you want to add on that?
No, I do apologize. I was responding to one of the questions here on the side, and I missed that. What are we addressing?
Well, no, we were just talking about how sometimes you go in there with an objective, right? You created a tabletop exercise that you said, I want it to accomplish this. I want to teach this. This is my training objective. But then you get into it and you realize your audience, whoever you're training at the time, you suddenly realize that they were missing some context beforehand, and you've got to redirect and adapt your model to be able to teach them that, or it's something else. You just add it onto your calendar essentially.
Right. So initially, yeah, absolutely. I had thought that it would be more going through the good processes of mission analysis and course of action development, and we kind of found a good system for adjudication. And we'd reference the details of movement rates or fire rates or times to process indirect fire missions. But when we kind of got into it, the guys got so focused on trying to integrate everything against the other person that we really had to have those references or guys' previous deployment experiences like readily available to know exactly, through this type of vegetation or behind this IV line, what would we expect here, or how far, would you really expect a Raven to operate? Because the book answer is a little different from what the actual answer is, and we wanted to have that in play.
Sure. No, that's a great point. That's excellent. Thanks, gentlemen. Go ahead, Alec. Go ahead. Jump on.
Yeah, I just want to tell Luke that whatever other issues the playtesters may have had, no one can question the realism of having the sergeant be the voice of wisdom.
If they pay attention, yes.
Yes, pay attention to the sergeant.
Right. Yeah, you have to listen to that voice of reason.
Yeah, they do.
Right. No, that's good. So with that, we'll move right at just short of the 30-minute mark, which I think is awesome because it'll give us a really good time to continue this conversation into the Q&A. And so we'll go ahead and start with some of the questions. And so the first one we have, how can militaries leverage hobby wargaming to find potential leaders? So with that, it was talked about from what some of the context we saw was, what about a national high school intramural war game championship where the winner gets a free slot, service academy of their choice? And so that's something, though, we can look at, and we can all agree, as society has changed and as culture has gone, I think gaming is a much more prevalent and much more socially mainstream concept, war games and games in general. And so with that, so I am a member of the U.S. Army esports team, and that is an outreach program that is meant to outreach to gamers and be able to build that bridge between the Army and the generations now that are involved in games and wargaming. I mean, there's all sorts of games. There's as far as the video games go, mostly that's a large preponderance of it. But I'm actually in tabletop wargaming. I'm a team captain, team manager of the Warhammer 40K scenario, and so, which is awesome. And we're not a small team by any means. There's over 20 of us. We're spread out across the United States. We even have a member in the UK who's currently serving over there. We have a member who's deployed and deploying to the Middle East. And so we're present everywhere, which is awesome because regional presence, we can't just get on and play a game with play a game on the internet with anybody necessarily. We have to play regionally as far as we can get to physically. But to that point, and talking about playing war games and socializing the topic, it's an excellent way to develop and build interest in the military and the aspects of it and where it goes. Whether, it doesn't have to be just the platoon, company, battalion level. It can be managing massive structures. I mean, you take we're talking about cardboard board games. You take I'm trying to remember the name of the board game, but it's essentially Afghanistan, and every player plays a different entity within Afghanistan. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it's published by GMT. But yes. Yeah. But that's kind of
plane. Is that it? A distant plane, something like that.
I think so. I can't quote me on that one.
Plane. I believe that's what you're referencing. Yes.
So you take that kind of environment. I mean, and so you consider the military has partners in education, or that's a much older program. I'm sure there's something new at this point, but the ability to engage with the community, playing war games, and you are cultivating future leaders. I mean, some of those people are going to go out and join the military in some aspect or another. And so to be able to do that, I mean, now there's an Air Force gaming team, and I'm very good friends with the captain of the Air Force gaming team. And we go out and we have exhibition matches of Warhammer 40K at major competitive events. And it's so crazy to see on Discord and Twitch the U.S. Army esports team playing a game against U.S. Air Force of 40K, which, it's largely platoon maneuvers and whatnot. But we go into some of these other aspects, and there's no need to hold back on that. The military can absolutely leverage wargaming to develop future leaders, and I think we're on the right start. It's part of our the Army, at least. I know that it's across the military as a whole, because I'm engaging with the other services as well. But it is part of the Army's people strategy for 2020 as we go forward. And so there's a lot that the Army can leverage in that regard. And so that was a great question. We appreciate it.
Two brief comments on that. I noticed you said, people-focused strategy. I mean, how are you going to engage the general population? They want something emotional and visceral. So the typical war game, I'm fascinated by what the right tactic was at Waterloo or the Battle of the Bulge, or, pick whatever you prefer. But that's not easy to engage with. It's inherently dry when you don't know much, when you don't have much context. You're looking at counters, or you're looking at something at a distance. You don't see people. I don't think it's chance that where the military makes connection as first-person shooters and so forth, because it's so emotionally visceral. What our hope is with Burden, like the Band of Brothers series, is that the sort of inherently burden of command decisions are out in the lives of your men, and the mission, and are you sending up the hill, and is it the right thing to do in 45 and so forth, is inherently emotional and will engage people. And again, I'll reference as evidence this War of Mine game, where again, you play civilians in Sarajevo, you're almost powerless. You're just trying to get supplies and not get killed. You're not it's not a power trip. It's anti-power trip. But I think they've had about 1 million, sold about 1 million copies. So people are hungry for emotionally meaningful experiences in movies and books, and I think in the right kind of war games also.
Absolutely. That's a very great point. Colin, Alec, you guys have anything to add to that question before we move to the next one?
One of the interesting things is that because our unit is a National Guard unit, we recruit directly into it. So we can showcase what we do. We can say, hey, now a lot of our things, because of the way we operate, we need people that are pre-trained before they can move on into being in a headquarters. They have to have so many years experience, so much AFSC time and everything. But we also have an air operations center, and we have a cyber squadron. So getting folks that feed through that and then maybe can move over into the higher operations is something that we try to do is get that cross pollination. But and there are a number of those. But again, the National Guard is so much smaller than big Air Force, big Army. But at least that's one of the methods we're using to keep ourselves up to strength.
It's awesome. That's great. Something you said, Luke, in regards to it. I mean, and especially from where I just came at with Sam's. My monograph there I was designing a proof of concept for another war game. But what came at me, the questions that came at me is how to build in ethical dilemmas and ethical issues. And I think you're absolutely right in regards of a narrative that connects people to the material. There's something, and it can be done. We've seen it done for cardboard games. We've seen it done in computer games. It absolutely can be done. This War of Mine is an excellent example. And to build that connection, and again, going back to history rhyming, to take something, I really enjoyed the sample of what we saw of Burden of Command and the ability to go in and make those hard choices, understanding it's not just a resource cost that's being made. You're talking about people. You're talking about what's connected to those people. Are they accomplishing their personal goals and motivations while you're also accomplishing yours? It can demonstrate, just like how the collaboration that goes into wargaming itself actually going into being an effective team. I mean, there's just so much to that, and to play into that, I think, is absolutely crucial in taking it to the next level, especially when you're talking about leaders and creating behaviors over time by trying to train and improve personalities. It's just such a big deal of having that core narrative.
Well, why do people volunteer and serve? Some small percentage probably want to test out the right tactics and strategy, right? But I suspect the larger part want to serve, right? They're emotionally engaged with the idea of service, with testing themselves, with testing their abilities to lead or be a member of a team. And so the more we can touch on those when we're speaking about engagement with people, I just think that's likely. It's the way you described.
So I think that this conversation kind of plays into the second question we had, which it goes hand in hand. And so the second question that we have is, in order to maintain the human element, we strive to, there it is at the bottom. So how have you planned the decision-making process to reflect the human element? I think we just talked about that some to a start, but going forward though, Luke, do you have anything you want to jump in on there, since you kind of led that?
Thank you. The way I describe Burden of Command is not a war game, but as a leadership RPG. But obviously, if you don't lead on the battlefield, people will die, and they admire your human qualities, but not your getting them killed, right? So you have to lead in tactics, strategy, and human. So throughout the design, our intention is to focus on the human. So the little snippets in the video got across the sort of interactive fiction aspect, right? We can pop any kind of decision from history or from our imagination, history preferred, to put people in difficult situations. I'll give another one I think any vet would recognize in modern warfare, which is, you run into the Germans, they're in a farmhouse, and one nice asset the U.S. military had was often artillery to deal with such situations. But you notice that the Germans have civilians with them in a farmhouse. Now, what is your decision here? You can save your men's life by continuing to use artillery. On the other hand, you will get more civilians killed. So you could assault, in which case you will probably get some of your men killed. And just to make it trickier, these are probably Italian civilians, which are technically enemy civilians, right? So it's just complicated. Is there a right answer? I don't know the right answer there. We try to give ones that aren't easy, because our intent is not necessarily to teach right answers, because I think right answers are tricky in many of these situations, but to teach you to think about them and to decide who you will be as a leader. So the interactive fiction is one component, but the battlefield, and I see there'll be a later question about soft factors, I'll allude to it. The battlefield is all about psychology. So all your units have morale. Events affect them, like shock, sort of an example of a non-usual mechanic. When the enemy shows a asset they have, you don't, like a tank arrives and you don't have a tank, then all units in line of sight of that tank take shock. They take psychological suppression because they realize they're disadvantaged. There's a wonderful book from between the wars called, I think, Battlefield Psychology, and he talks about that. He was with the Austro-Hungarians, and they looked up and they saw that the other side had, or the Russians, they saw they had planes, and they all became demoralized because we don't have planes and they do. And then their planes finally showed up, and everybody sort of perked up. Now, where was the number of bullets in the cartridge part of that? There was none. It's all psychological. So we do a lot of that kind of, can the leaders rally the men to do difficult things, in a nutshell.
That's awesome. That's great. Colin or Alec, you have anything you would like to add on that?
Talking to Luke's point, yeah, that's really great to have. It sounds like having that narrative, psychological, developmental aspect for the leaders to go inside, alongside the pure tactics, strategy, making sure you understand all the pieces and the capabilities you have. Really seems like they go parallel.
They intertwine heavily.
You have to practice both.
One of the things we'll do on that, just to give you another flavor. So we've learned in the teaching aspect we talked about earlier to force people to articulate their plan, right? Because otherwise they don't pay any attention to what they're told. But if you force them to articulate a plan, then we can have the NPCs, non-player characters, your lieutenants, for example, react to you and give their feedback. And we're probably a little more proactive than lieutenants might be in a real war. But they might say, sir, you really want, or the sergeant might say, sir, do we really want to go that way where we've had intelligence? The Germans have minefields, right? And then you have to justify yourself. So it's a plan, but you're still engaged in a human conversation to engage your direct reports. And maybe you should change your plan, but maybe they don't agree. So who are you going to pick?
The Air Force is a little different when you get into the human element because you're not up close and personal at 30,000 feet a lot of the times. And one of the interesting elements, though, in Air Force wargaming is aircraft loss. The Army, losses are going to happen. We're driving tanks. We're infantry. It's going to happen. The Air Force, we don't lose a lot of planes. So when you start having aircraft losses not just happen, but begin to accumulate, boy, that gets people's attention really fast. I mean, it's that talk about psychological. Everyone's thinking, how do we replace them? The number of F-22s is fixed. So if you play with those, you're dealing with the precious commodity, and yet you have that problem of using the asset that's there. It has all this capability for a reason. So again, it's very different from, leading a squad or platoon, what's behind that hedgerow kind of stuff. Where you would have that is if there's air defenses that are in a place that are going to be very difficult to deal with. Do you take your chances against the air defenses? Do you tell the Army, we can't go there? Sorry, you're just going to have to take it on the chin. That's kind of the Air Force dynamic.
There's a wonderful movie on World War II Air Force, which suffered much more plane loss than modern, 12 O'Clock High, which is about the burden of command, but not as experienced. Well, it is experienced at that moment in the cockpit in the bombers, but he had the burden of command for essentially running the equivalent of a company, right? His wing or whatever it was, and the stress on him over time as the casualties mounted.
Absolutely. That is should be required viewing. I own the DVD. It's a great thing. And what's really interesting, of course, is the parallel between the outgoing commander who is losing his nerve and the new belligerent commander who comes in, he's strict, he whips him into shape, and then he too suffers what we call PTSD, but they called it battle fatigue. The inevitable result of that strain burns you out. You can only do that for so long, and that's a great depiction of it.
I think that's an excellent segue into this next question, if we can pull that up. Actually, if we could move to the question after that. I'm sorry, the fourth question. We'll come back to the third question. I think this fourth question is great. So this goes right into what we were just discussing.
I'm happy to comment on that, but I've been saying a few things, so I'll wait in case others want to.
Colin, I think you said you had something for the third question, though, right? That I just
by the time I was responding, it's for the other one.
I got you. No, that's cool. So Alec, you just, more or less, we just hit this question up front. I think something that goes into this too is understanding that, I appreciate that we, how we're referring to things in soft or hard. I'm going to lean a little more into JFC Fuller in regards of like the mental realm, the moral realm, and the physical realm. And so, in the physical realm, we've got attack, protect, and move. In the moral realm. And so when you start paying attention to, given that there's these three realms here, and the physical is very important, and you start looking at the tactical realm, you understand the science, you're talking about bullets, you're talking about ranges and distances, very crucial that you understand that, because those sergeants that are going to sit there and say, hey, here's the feasibility of this plan, they know that because they've learned it over time. And we hope that in some cases, war games, there are some war games that are developed that can train those things, right? Can help train that science. But then you come to the, if you want to call it soft factors, or the science that goes with the moral realm or the mental realm. And there is, in the mental, we're talking about fear, we're talking about imagination, we're talking about will, and that was what was alluded to earlier when you're talking about losing planes and what that means over time and distance. When tanks enter the field and where they started in World War I and what they did in World War II and what it took to get rid of them. Yes, solutions were created, but the shock and awe that tanks or that planes or that artillery can put into the effect, and understanding how so Fuller had your objective of where you're trying to get within the three realms, if you put them over space and time somewhat in your mind, and then if you push and you put effort against increasing the fear of the humans that you're engaging on the battlefield, and you use that to essentially allow their imagination to run away with them, which then totally disregards reason, which goes into the moral realm, and you can overcome their willpower by doing so. And the war games, you can incorporate these kind of aspects into it. You see some games have morale factors, some games it becomes a quantifiable element, almost like energy or their endurance capability. And then in other cases you have where you hit a certain threshold, and sure, the game might be a statistic or a dice roll or some kind of random, if you overcome this threshold, like we saw with the commander 90% or 65% kind of deal from Burden of Command, it could be something like that. And war games can help demonstrate as you're starting to push things to their threshold. Logistics are important. If logistics were easy, they'd call them operations, right? However, when it comes to the human realm, there's so much more with humans and the human terrain and what you're trying to work through and how you can, everyone's ideally wants to bound together their team to make them a machine, but then you have to recognize that really you have a whole socio-cultural system of people that you've got to get buy-in, and some of them aren't as strong as others. It's just a matter that you have to accept and acknowledge. And war games can demonstrate these things. And I think it's very important they do that so that leaders can start getting their mind set for those things.
Any system that doesn't have morale in it is grossly unrealistic. You have to have some kind of mechanic. Troops don't fight to the death normally. Right. It's a very rare thing. They do great. I'm gonna throw a little shade as a Warhammer 40K second edition player. I take great exception with the subsequent editions, which greatly weakened the importance of morale, and had too many units that basically would fight to the death or were effectively unbreakable. Chaos Marines. But the impact of that in any potential commander, anyone at that upper level, to understand that you don't have to take huge losses. People play these shooter games, these tank games. You guys are talking about your tank goes down the road and blows up. What does the rest of the platoon think about that? The tank platoon. Yes. Oh boy, now we're down one. And one of the things that we talked about movies, the portrayal of the troops in with Oddball in Kelly's Heroes. That cynical, we're just going to try to get through this. They'll fight hard when they're cornered, but their big thing is trying not to get it. And I love the deceptive stuff they did. They souped up their tanks, field mods. Smart. That part was realistic.
Yeah. A couple items in that. So moral, there's two ways to read that. Moral in the sense of morale on the battlefield. And there's a long tradition in tactical board games, like starting a squad leader around that, morale checks, so forth. And we follow some of that tradition, but we can bring in more events that affect that through the narrative and so forth. But we do try to get in more subtle soft factors that connect. What we call trust, and I'd call respect, which is really experience. Units gain experience over time, but if you're gaining experience as leader, then the troops respect you for your capacity, right, to lead well. But also, do they trust you? And we define trust as, do they think you have their interests at heart? Or are you trying to get another promotion? Are you a butcher, or are you thinking about their laws as well as the objective? And so that influences your morale effect. And then the other word for morale is morality, right? So Carl Melentes, who was a remarkable person, who was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, who resigned during the Vietnam War and went and served as lieutenant. Not many people did that, given the opportunity, to be in such a privileged position at Oxford and then resign, go serve. He wrote an excellent book called What It Is Like to Go to War, about the spiritual side of war. And the essence of his point is spiritual doesn't mean good. War is hell, but it is often, sometimes heaven, but it is spiritual in the sense that you are in the presence of life and death. So what could be more spiritual than that? And what his argument was, and his advice to military, more present military is, soldiers are trained very well, as alluded to, on the physical and the ability to kill, very efficient at it, very effective. On the other hand, they're not necessarily trained, I can't speak to the moment, but often they've not been trained, Vietnam being a classical period, to how to handle having killed or having their friend been killed next to them. And so that kind of aspect, I don't claim we do a great job on it, but we do try to approach it and deal with it in the sense that over time, as I think was said earlier with regard to the plane movie, right? 12 O'Clock High, inevitably people gain stress, what was called combat fatigue during World War II, PTSD today. I mean, it will happen with enough exposure. And so the units and leaders require stress over time. And I'll give away a bit of a spoiler. Every leader in the game, the characters, can break down from PTSD if given enough stress, which we don't tell you in advance, but will happen to you depending on what you did with these leaders during the battlefield. And then we try to realistically model that within the limits we can. But we try to put the player on all kinds of decisions. The last one, just for kicks, and I'll shut up, is logistics can be engaging. There's a very successful game called Paperworks Please, where you act as a border guard, constantly making ethical decisions around who gets in and out across the border. And our writers did a good job of making one of the most engaging moments for me personally when I was doing paperwork in the game and had to worry about gas supplies. And I made some edgy moral decisions, which then haunted me with the free French for several subsequent scenes. And I was sweating that almost more than battlefield situations because I'd been too clever with how I was going to procure gas.
Sure. No, that's excellent points, and that's really great. And appreciate the input on that. It's a tough area to address because it's not physically in front of us. And so, but with that, if we can go back to question 3, and Colin, take it away.
So
sorry, yeah, we go to the TTX one. I think that's it. Sorry. There we go. Thank you. Sorry.
So I kind of got some thoughts regarding, from a tabletop exercise or a map X or something, and also on the game side. From the tabletop exercise side, our soldiers, while they were doing it, really kind of got that feedback almost from the data provided from the map, or they they just couldn't get people to certain places in certain times. Making sure you're kind of doing that in space and time really opened their eyes, because somebody's actually thinking counter to them, so they're very often coming from a direction they hadn't prepared for. It was great reinforcement or penalization in that sense. Outside of that, we just referenced a lot of the doctrine or anecdotal experiences we had as the data to reinforce those. On the game side, so far, I would say like the combat mission Black Sea and Shock Force 2 is the most penalizing game I found that makes you pay for bad decisions and bad instructions to your troops. And while it's more of a micromanagement of your forces than what you normally would do, even that is still valuable to teach the lessons of trade analysis and putting certain sectors on and massing your forces, or getting combined arms together. Because if you don't, you guys are clearly going to pay for it. And that type of data feedback has been great to kind of practice and sear that into my mind to try and become better and keep guys alive later.
Oh, that's great. Another one that I'd recommend too is Command Modern Operations Simulator. You can set up. I mean, the science to it is solid, between flight time from planes to missiles to ADA systems and and they're using essentially Google Earth for terrain management and whatnot. It's fantastic. Another data-driven platform, I would argue, very data-driven, not as much new. I mean, you essentially have to create a narrative of your own if you wanted to use that platform, but it's really great in doing exactly what you're talking about, Colin. Those great points. So with that, we've got about 5 more minutes left. Really appreciate everybody's time. If we can bring up the final conclusion slide, and I'll give everybody about a minute for any parting shots. I'm sorry we didn't get to any of the other questions. I do appreciate it. But so we'll, as that's coming up, Colin, you got any parting comments?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity here. I think personally on the National Guard side for normal units, I would personally look towards, platoons and companies to probably conduct 12 operations at least a year, whether that's, in the training at like an XCTC or a CTC or live fire, or personally developed on like a map exercise, tabletop exercise, or something, just to get those repetitions. Because by the time you go through the 4 or 5 year sustainable readiness model, training cycle, a lot of people come and go, and without the consistent repetitions, I think a lot of young guys they don't get the reps they need.
Awesome. Thank you. Luke, your parting comments.
One new thought struck me from listening to this group at the beginning and realizing that you all do a lot of military role playing in your field exercises and your paper exercise. But, when you gather people around the table, much more than hobby gamers do, is that there's a wonderful opportunity that has been realized yet, I think would be compelling for both military and civilian side, would be to have a multiplayer game where it's live people cooperating in these military situations. Ours is a solitary solo game because it's just a technological issue right now. But what if the lieutenants in your company in World War II were other players, right? Sure. And you must all deal with real human issues in constructed context. I think that'd be very powerful. You guys do it in paper and on the field. I don't know how well it's done yet digitally.
Oh, that's great. And we do have some virtual constructive simulations that do have it at a certain point, but bringing in those narratives like that and kind of giving folks a little bit more to role play with is definitely something that I think we should consider as well. That's a great point. Alec, your parting comments.
Well, I think that, one of the things I would recommend folks is if you're trying to build a culture of wargaming or you're trying to incorporate, make sure you bring that enjoyment factor. Luke's got that, all the stuff. We couldn't do bells and whistles. It's a map, but we made a point to make the game attractive, to make people want to play. It's a card driven game. And we just used repurposed playing cards, and we used Jack Daniels playing cards because people see those lying out and that immediately piques it. What are you guys doing? Oh, this is a theater, simulation. We use Jack Daniels. Yeah, sure. We play at the bar, and it creates a thing where people really want to be a part of it. And I will say that one of the things that has really helped us, and I urge anyone who can, when you get folks doing it on their own time, then you're doing something right. And ours became a lunch club kind of thing. You go and you order out during drill weekends, and it was, hey, who's playing this lunch? Who's playing today? And that also, if it's constructive, and it is, you're now getting basically extra time added to your duty day in terms of teaching, because it's not counting against any other training time. And you'd be surprised how many senior officers are quite happy to facilitate that kind of stuff that doesn't come out of their schedule.
That's awesome. Thanks, Alec, for sharing. That's great. Great to hear, because going to my closing comments, in that wargaming is absolutely a methodology that can be used for the development of leaders across all the realms that we've discussed, across the physical and the operational science and the warfare that goes into that, and then and the art and the physical aspects that go to it, as well as the mental and the moral areas that we've discussed. And that wargaming has this approach, and I would like to say, with technology and everything we have, it can be just as much pen and paper. It can be playing cards, as well as it can be digital platforms and data-driven platforms, and we have this available. And so I strongly recommend everyone that's out there listening, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Hope you enjoy the rest of Connections, and please seek out ways to continue to implement wargaming and the development of your leaders and subordinates. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.